Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the ISO 9001-2015 Introduction to the World's Most Popular Standard webinar. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone. All of our participants are on mute, but we absolutely want to take your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will be addressing questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not this presentation will be available after we're finished. The short answer is yes. We will provide the slides shortly after we're finished. You'll be able to download those in PDF format. And if you'd like to re-watch this webinar, all of our past webinars are hosted on our YouTube page. You can access that on the PGR website under the previously recorded webinars link. Our topics for today, we're going to explore what ISO 9001 is, and we're going to facilitate our understanding of it by deconstructing the scope statement that appears early in the standard. We're going to talk a little bit about where the ISO standards come from. We're going to have an exploration of a critical document called Annex SL. This is a key document in terms of the content within ISO 9001. I have a brief cover-to-cover review, kind of give you a sense of what's where in the ISO 9001 standard. And then a key section on the ideas that are presented by ISO 9001, try to give you a sense of what the key concepts are. A couple of concluding remarks and then your questions. ISO 9001's official title is Quality Management Systems - Requirements. And it's had that title since it was originally written. And the intent of ISO 9001 is unchanged. ISO 9001 is now in its 5th edition. It was originally published in 1988. Second revision was in 94, third in 2000, fourth in 2008. So this is now the 5th edition of the 9001 standard. Going back over the last 3 editions, this scope statement is completely unchanged. It states that this international standard specifies requirements for a quality management system when an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, and aims to enhance customer satisfaction through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement of the system and the assurance of conformity to customer and applicable statutory regulatory requirements. So I want to take this statement and I want to kind of break it down, because breaking this statement down helps you really to get your arms around why some of the things are written into the ISO 9001 standard in the manner that they are. So to begin with, it specifies requirements for a quality management system. Now this is an important phrase, and it accomplishes something that's key to understanding what ISO 9001 is all about, and that is that it is requirements for a system. These are not product requirements. ISO 9001 is not a product standard. It does not intend to tell an organization how to manufacture its product. Any organization that is ISO 9001 certified or seeking certification is still expected to define for itself how the products are going to be made, how the products are going to be controlled, and how to separate a good product from a bad product. So again, ISO 9001, first key idea, not a product standard. The scope continues when an organization needs to demonstrate its ability to consistently provide products and services. Now this statement is also key. the idea that it is not exclusively a product standard. Now, if you go back to the early versions, the first and second edition, the thinking at that time was that ISO 9001 was going to be geared primarily to companies that manufactured tangible products. Now, as the years went on, it was clear that ISO 9001 and the principles that it represented offered equal benefit to service-based organizations. And so it is now viewed as being a standard written to accommodate essentially any type of organization, whether it is an organization that provides tangible products or non-tangible services. Meeting customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements and aiming to enhance customer satisfaction. Now, this is a key piece. Frankly, it's the central cornerstone of what ISO 9001 is all about. An ISO 9001 certified organization is required to be tuned in to their customers' needs and responsive to the feedback that they get from their customers. It's a key focal point that's been written into the scope statement. Through the effective application of the system, including processes for improvement and assurance of conformity. So these final statements here, they acknowledge that this is not something that you implement and forget about. Improvement is a huge part of what's written into ISO 9001, this whole idea that you improve over time. Indeed, the phrase improvement appears multiple times in ISO 9001. It's a central idea. So in terms of where these standards come from, ISO does stand for something. We get this question once in a while. What does ISO stand for? It stands for the International Organization for Standardization. Now, of course, that doesn't make any sense in English, but you have to remember that the ISO itself is headquartered in Switzerland, and it does actually translate to ISO in its native language. So who is ISO? What is ISO? It's a collective that's made up of numerous international members. Now, here in the United States, our representative to the ISO is the American National Standards Institute. Each of the standards that is written by the ISO gets assigned to a committee. Now, in the case of ISO 9001, it's a technical committee, and it happens to be Technical Committee 176. Technical Committee 176 itself is made up of numerous members from around the world, including folks from the ANSI. So the idea is that the standard is developed on a global scale, and it includes representation from as many interested parties as possible so that it reflects what is agreed to as important in terms of developing a standard of this nature. So to understand how the standard is organized, why things appear in the order that they do, we're going to take a few minutes now to discuss a key document that was developed 3 years before the 9001-2015 standard was published, and that is Annex SL. Now, Annex SL, you might hear the phrase high-level outline, Annex XL. Annex SL is part of a larger ISO publication called Directives Part 1, the Consolidated ISO Supplement Procedures for ISO. It's a self-imposed standard that the ISO has written on how to write standards, essentially. And if you're so inclined, you can read it yourself. It's available for download free from the ISO website. Excuse me. Now, when Annex SL was first published back in 2012, it was written by the Joint Technical Coordination Group. And what this group did, they wrote a 10-section blueprint for authoring the ISO family of standards. Annex SL, what it was written to do was to provide common terms, core definitions, and a harmonious structure, so that if an organization wanted to add layers to their management systems, if they were ISO 9001 and wanted to add ISO 14001, or if they were ISO 9001 and ISO 14001 and they wanted to add ISO 50001 and so forth. If all of the standards are structured in essentially the same way, it makes the argument that the organization can add those pieces without having to completely overhaul the work that's already been done. And that was very attractive to the greater community, especially obviously companies that had multiple certifications. So at this point we're approaching late 2019, just about every standard that the ISO publishes has completed its transition. Now, there are obviously standards that are in the midst of their transition deadlines. Some of these deadlines extend into 2021, but for the most part, the work has been done. The standards that are going to be updated to Annex SL format, that work has been completed. Here's an example of how Annex SL works. Now, on the left, you have section 9.2.1, which is written for internal audits. And you can see how the verbiage is exactly the same. And you can note where the X's are, and how when the TC 176 folks wrote the 9001-2015 standard, they used the Annex SL format and morphed it into section 9.2.1 as it appears in ISO 9001-2015. So again, core terms, core definitions, root verbiage that is intended to be unchanged in going from one standard to the other. Now, Annex SL has 7 auditable sections. These are numbered 4 through 10. I'm going to very briefly walk you through the titles of these sections, kind of give you a sense of what's where. Section 4 is called Context of the Organization. It covers a handful of key high-level ideas. Quality management system is covered here, the idea of processes. Interested parties is covered here. The scoping of the quality management system is covered here. Very high-level stuff. In section 5, we have requirements that pertain to the development of the quality policy, defining responsibility and authority, focus on the customer. There's some very important managerial and leadership requirements that appear here. Section 6 exists for 2 primary requirements. Those are risk-based thinking or risk actions and quality objectives. Section 6 is also where planning of changes is discussed. Section 7 is called support. There's a number of items in here. We have resources, training is covered here, internal communication is covered here. This is also where measurement devices are actually captured, what you might refer to as calibration requirements. Documented information, this is revision levels on documents, retention of records, and so forth. All of that is captured in Section 7. Section 8 is called Operation, and you might think of this as the day-to-day, as it were. This is where we cover the determining customer requirements, so like a sales or order entry activity. Design is covered here. Externally provided processes, what you might refer to as purchasing, is covered here. Production and service provision, release of products, and non-conforming product control. These are all items that are covered in Section 8. And then in Section 9, we have performance evaluation. This is where management review and internal audit are found. Measurement of customer satisfaction is found here. Evaluation of this information is found here. And then the standard, the auditable portion of the standard, I should say, concludes in Section 10. And Section 10 is primarily where we find the requirements for corrective action and continual improvement. Now, to take a step back and address the other contents of the 9001 standard, if we kind of do a cover-to-cover review, if you begin in Section 0.1, you'll find a general statement. It provides an overview on what ISO 9001 is all about, some intention on who it benefits. It talks very briefly about risk-based thinking, Plan, Do, Check, Act, and it provides definitions for 4 terms that appear in the standard. And again, you have to remember this is verbiage that's taken directly from Annex SL, and hence, in the case of ISO 9001, we don't actually use the term should, which means a recommendation. Obviously, shall is very prevalent, but should is not used in ISO 9001. We also have the terms may, which represents a permission, and then can, representing possibility or capability. In Section 0.2, the 7 quality management principles appear. This is a direct reference to the ISO 9000 standard, which is called the Fundamentals and Vocabulary document. These 7 principles obviously inform to a great extent what appears in ISO 9001 itself, this whole idea of focus on the customer, the process approach, and so forth. Process approach gets its own call out in Section 0.3. The whole idea that the system built on ISO 9001 should follow the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. There's even a graphic that's provided that walks you through what the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle is and how it works clausally within the standard itself. Section 033 talks about risk-based thinking. We're going to have further content on that as we continue through the standard. And then 0.4 talks about the relationship with other quality management system standards. Those other 2 standards are 9000 and 9004. Getting into the main sections, in Section 1 we have the scope, and of course we explored that a little bit earlier in our presentation. Section 2 is called normative reference. It establishes that all official terms and definitions can be found in the ISO 9000 standard. The reason that it's listed as a normative reference is that the definitions from 9000 are binding in the context of the audit. Now, that shouldn't worry you too much. Most of those definitions are fairly broad, but again, by listing it as a normative reference, it establishes that the content is admissible in the context of an audit. Section 3 is called Terms and Definitions. At present, there is no content in Section 3. It's possible that it could be used as a future placeholder for ISO 9001 specific definitions, but at present, it is empty. We've already reviewed sections 4 through 10, so let's jump ahead to Annex A. Now, Annex A is a very helpful section, and it's definitely one that I recommend a careful reading of to anyone that is new to the ISO 9001 standard. There's several key points of information here, and again, I always like to point out, because it appears in the 9001 standard itself, it is admissible in the context of the audit. You can use it to your advantage. You can use it to defend the approach that you've taken. And there's a couple of areas where that's very relevant. In A1, structure and terminology, it states that the organization does not have to align their documentation to match ISO 9001:2015, and it doesn't have to use the specific terms that are found in the standard. So let's say, just for example, you decide that you want to have a purchasing procedure. And so you write a purchasing procedure. You are not required to number that procedure 8.4, just because section 8.4 of the standard is where the requirements for interface with external providers appear. And additionally, if you want to refer to the folks you buy from as suppliers, you can do so. You don't have to suddenly start calling them external providers just because that's what the standard says. So that's all covered in section Annex A1. Annex A2 provides some explanation on the intent in changing all references of product to read products and services. This was one of the more interesting changes that happened with the 2015 standard, was that it took a step beyond just having the term products within the standard, and then a little note saying that when we say products, we mean products and services. Now, when you read the standard, every reference reads products and services. They've really pushed it out in terms of showing that this is what they expect. A3 talks about interested parties and some intent on identifying who your interested parties are. Risk-based thinking is discussed in Annex A4. This is a key item, and it establishes that a formal process for risk management is not required. This is a misconception that we still see coming up from time to time, this whole idea that you have to have a formal process. You don't. You have to have a process. You have to have your arms around what your approach to this requirement is going to be. But to have a FEMA program or a SWAT program or something along those lines is not mandatory. In Annex A5, applicability, there's some discussion on why the term exclusions was removed. That had appeared as recently as the 2008 version of ISO 9001. In Annex A6, they talk about the phrase documented information and the fact that that phrase replaced the terms procedure, record, and document. In Annex A7, we have some further explanation on the intent of the organizational knowledge requirement and how it's to be approached. And finally, in Annex A8, we have some discussion on externally provided products and services and who that phrase applies to and what the expectations are. The standard concludes with Annex B, which provides some discussion on the relationship between ISO 9001 and several other ISO publications, and then finally a bibliography. Now, what I'd like to do for the balance of my presentation, I'd like to give you an introduction to 5 central and key ideas that appear within ISO 9001. And I've tried to also provide causal linkages where possible. Wanting to help you understand ISO 9001 in terms of key concepts, key ideas. So these are the 5 that I've selected: scope, processes, accountability, effectiveness, and improvement. So let's begin with scope. Early on in the standard, in section 4.3, you are directed to develop what's referred to as a scope statement. Now, you can think of a scope statement as a statement on what it is you do. This is what we're certifying. The scope statement represents the extent of your system and the boundaries of your system. So I've provided a couple of examples: design, fabrication, and assembly of collapsible tripods, distribution of fasteners, plating, heat treating, and sorting of metal stampings. You know, again, you can read that and you can get a sense of what this organization does and what's in their certification. Now, the scope statement that you develop ideally will eventually be the same as that shown on the ISO 9001:2015 certificate that's issued by PJR. Now, a couple of things that I want to warn you about and make you aware of. Do not list an item on your scope that won't be available for audit. If you have, for example, field installation in your scope statement, that means that we need to go to a remote site and audit that field installation activity. We cannot put something on the certificate that we don't audit. If you've purchased new equipment that isn't up and running yet, and this represents an expansion of your scope, if we show up and the equipment isn't running, we can't add it to the scope of the certificate. That's the rule. In order to list it on the certificate, it has to be subject to audit. Also, I always warn organizations, resist the urge to be too wordy in your scope statement. Remember that the scope statement is not intended to be a marketing statement. It's not intended to be advertising. This is a scope statement that reflects what your quality management system was developed to control. So here's an example. Let's say we have an organization that says our scope is laser cutting, water jet cutting, progressive die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution of flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. If that's the scope statement you're going with, our audit has to include everything. We have to audit laser cutting, water jet cutting, die cutting, plating, heat treating, and distribution. And if we show up on audit day and you tell us, oh, sorry, the plating line's down, well, unfortunately, we can't include plating on your certificate if that is the case. Let's go to the next slide. We would also have to audit flanges, springs, shims, bolts, and barrels. Everything that you list in that scope statement has to be included. So resist the urge to turn it into a marketing speak type statement. Second idea that I want to cover today is processes. This is another item that gets mentioned early in the standard. It appears in section 4.4. Every organization has to determine what their processes are and how they interface with each other. Section 4.4 states that a quality management system is supposed to be made up of processes. Now, this concept of process is so important that we've actually developed an entirely different webinar for it. The interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. I definitely recommend, if you're in the early stages of implementing your system, check that webinar out. We've given it several times. You'll be able to find it under previously recorded webinars. A lot of key information there. And processes as a concept, this cascades throughout the standard. There's a lot of places where this appears. It talks about using the process approach in section 5 under leadership. Aligning your quality objectives to processes. That appears in section 6.2.1. Making sure that staff are competent for their processes in section 7. Making sure that you have the infrastructure for your processes, also section 7. External processes is discussed in section 8, and reviewing process performance is discussed in section 9.3.2. We encourage you, we implore you even, to make your processes as personal and unique to your business as possible. This is going to go a long way to making sure that your quality management system is adding value to your organization and that you understand it. If these are your processes, you're going to have a much better understanding of what's going on in your quality management system. Absolutely resist the urge to name your processes after the sections of the ISO 9001 standard. That's not going to do you any good. It's not going to make your audits any easier. Our third key concept is accountability. ISO 9001:2015 demands that everyone within the scope of the system be included in the system and be included in the audit process, or at least available during the audit process. Now this is most directly addressed in Section 511. In Section 511, the standard states that top management has to make itself accountable. That actual verbiage is used, accountable for the effectiveness of the quality management system. It's on you, management team, if the quality management system is not effective. Now, this whole idea of accountability comes up in a couple of other key places. Product release records, inspection records, must name names. That's in Section 8.6. That's actually one of the stronger requirements in the standard. Any problems, including customer complaints, have to be responded to with appropriate systemic action. You'll find that in Section 10.2. The organization is required to define roles, responsibilities, and authorities. That's in Section 5.3. And everybody is supposed to be aware of the quality policy and how they contribute to the effectiveness of the system. And those requirements are rooted in Section 5.2 and Section 7.3, respectively. Our fourth key idea is effectiveness. Now, this is a very prevalent concept. There's a lot of places where you are required to measure the effectiveness of something. And the idea is that you should know at any given time how well or how poorly things are going within your operation. The basic idea of effectiveness is most succinctly established in Section 441C. Where we have this kind of blanket statement where it says that the organization has to determine and apply the criteria and methods, including monitoring, measurements, and related performance indicators needed to ensure the effective operation and control of processes. So here are some key areas where this idea of effectiveness is more specifically discussed. You have to track quality objectives, 6.2.1. You have to evaluate the effectiveness of training or competency actions, 7.2. You have to evaluate external provider performance, 8.4. You have to inspect your products, 8.6. You have to measure customer satisfaction, 9.1.2. You have to review overall trends in your system, 9.1.3. You have to conduct internal audits, 9.2. You have to look at your overall system in management review, 9.3, and you have to take efforts targeting improvement, 10.1. Now, the final cornerstone concept that I want to explore today is improvement. Now, I touched on this a little bit earlier in the presentation. Improvement represents an evolution of an older idea. From the 2000 and 2008 standards called continual improvement. Now, the current concept of improvement talks about improvement as being made up of a number of things. Still continual improvement, obviously, but also things like reactive changes, breakthroughs, and so forth. Improvement is explored primarily in Section 10.1 of the standard. It states that you shall determine and select opportunities for improvement and implement the necessary actions to meet customer requirements and enhance customer satisfaction. Improvement is also discussed in a couple of other key sections. In Section 4.4, it says you must continually improve your system. In 5.1.1, you have to promote improvement. In 5.2.1, it says that your quality policy has to address improvement. In 5.3c, it says that your responsibilities have to include reporting on improvement opportunities. 6.1.1 says that risk actions should target improvement. 7.1.1 says that resources have to enable you to achieve improvement. 7.3 says that people that work for the organization should be aware of the impact they have on improvement. And then finally, 932 states that opportunities for improvement should be among the things discussed within management review. So in conclusion, ISO 9001:2015 remains the world's most utilized standard. Believe it or not, there's just over 1.3 million registered companies worldwide. Organizations that are seeking certification to 9001 need to bear in mind the big picture of what ISO 9001:2015 seeks to promote. Now, if you're ready for a deeper dive, we are working on a clause-by-clause primer course for anyone who is new to ISO 9001 and needs to have a better understanding in preparation for an audit or other purpose. The pending title for that course is going to be ISO 9001:2015 Clausal Overview. We're hoping to launch the course sometime in early 2020. It will be available online and free of charge. I'd like to also invite you to join us for one of our other webinars. We have another webinar currently on ISO 9001. It's called Anticipating Auditor Expectations in Key Areas. It's a deep dive on some of the more common issues in ISO 9001:2015 audits and what is typically expected for those areas. Non-applicable clauses, permissible exclusions, and exemptions. This is a deep dive on the topic of exemptions and the right approach to take in determining which apply to you. The interaction of processes presentation I mentioned earlier. We also have webinars on Stage 1 auditing, AS 9100, ITF 16949, and a variety of other topics. We would definitely love to keep in touch with you. The best way for us to do that is for you to opt in for automatic updates. If you go to our website at www.pjr.com, go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address, and click subscribe. You'll be opted in for news updates automatically. I do thank you for your time and attention today. Again, I'll remind you that copies of today's presentation will be available for download shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch with voiceover, it will be available on our YouTube page, again, in a short time. Are there any questions today? Okay, thank you all for your time. Have a great day.